So Terry and I were closest, and we kind of grew up together. We played together, and we had an awful lot of things in common, as young children would do, you know. So I suppose from the time that I was from about 6 onwards, we became very close, you know, because we had an interest in toys. Terry was a great man for building model aircraft, and I was his labourer. I was always the guy that did the sort of the mullicking around, so to speak. And but still, we got on very, very well as we got older. Then we used to go places. One of the great places we used to go to play, even though we were Southsiders, was up to Goulding's Glen. And that was a magic place for playing around cowboys and Indians and war games and all that sort of thing, because the area was used by the army, certainly by the British Army in the First World War, for manoeuvres. And there were humps and hollows, and there were trenches and all sorts of things to play with up there. And there was a lake, and you get frogs down at the lakes and all that sort of thing. So we spent many happy hours up there. We used to get the bus up to Dillon's Cross, and then down to the Glen. And there'd be others there as well. We'd be shooting each other to bits, and playing cowboys and Indians, and arrows flying everywhere. But I noticed that Terry was talking a lot in terms of wanting to be a priest. He seemed to gravitate towards that. Now, he wasn't over religious or holy or anything like that, but that was sort of the direction that he seemed to want to go. And you know, when he was 13, he decided, the summer of the time that he was 13, he decided that he'd do something about it. So he made contact via his mother with, I think, a Father Tobin of the SMAs, probably in Blackrock at the time. And Father Tobin eventually called to the house. I remember when he did call to the house the day we were out in the back garden playing away, and the next thing Terry was called in, Father Tobin had come to see him. So I stayed out in the garden. Terry went in, and Father Tobin chatted to him, and it kind of took off from there. There was never a time after that he wasn't going to go, you know. And my mother asked all the questions, all the right questions. My father was at work at the time, so he wasn't necessarily involved at that level, but my mother was wanting to know, like, would everything work out all right, and what would happen if he didn't want to go through, and all of that. So that was all explained, and eventually a letter arrived from Father Tobin as to what he would need to bring with him going away. And that was a tear too. I remember going into Hips next door to the Savoy at the time, when he got his suit to go away in. And there's a photograph actually in the album somewhere at home where he has the parcel under his arm, and we're walking away up past the Munster Arcade. There's myself and my mother and himself, and that was the day he bought the going away suit. So we just waited then until we got the final, or he got the final go ahead to go to Ballinafad the following September. I would imagine around the 13th or there was mid-September of 1949. And off he went. Went down that morning to the bus station. His uncle very kindly said he'd go with him as far as Limerick and put him on the train then to go to Claremorris, I think, from Limerick. Well, Galway and then on to Claremorris. So he did that, and he said goodbye to Terry in Limerick, and Terry, off he went to Ballinafad. Now, he did tell me, all right, that when they got to Claremorris, they were met by a tractor and a trailer. And one of the priests from Ballinafad. I don't know who he was, but he was driving the tractor. So all the luggage was thrown up onto because there were a number of other guys from Cork and elsewhere, picked up one or two in Limerick as well, threw all the luggage up on the trailer, and off they sped into the night to Ballinafad, all sitting up on top of their suitcases, you know. So when they got to Ballinafad then, the priest that brought them up, opened up, brought them into total darkness. They stood in the hall, and then the priest that brought them disappeared because he had to go down to the boiler house to start up the generator, and started the generator, and then the lights came on. And then they were sent off to their various dormitories, and they were given their beds, and it all started from there. From the following day then they had to appear in class, and it really was, I suppose, a secondary school at that stage. They went right through, he did his inter, and then he went on from the inter then and completed his leaving. I think it was 1953 when he finished his leaving cert and his matric. And then they were sent off down to Clough-Ballymore. So that was his first year's novitiate. He got the collar in Clough-Ballymore and the soutane, and then he was told very clearly that when he came back on holidays, he was always to wear a hat, and he wasn't to be seen on his own walking in town with his sister, unless he had another brother with him. All very strict in those days. So it went on from Clough-Ballymore. He was a year there, I think, and then he came out here to Wilton, and he was another year or two here, I'm not quite sure, doing, I think, theology. I think he did his sort of theology here, and then off up to Drummondine. And he stayed in Drummondine then until he was ordained in 1960. So that was the story of him from start to finish, becoming a fully fledged ordained priest in the SMA.
The day of ordination must have been a big day. Who attended? With your parents there? And
well, there's a story, a personal story about that with regard to myself, and it goes to show you the times that were in it, because when it was a Wednesday that he was to be ordained, and I was at work at the time, and I remember our managing director was on a tour of inspection, and my boss man at the time, who was a very nice man, felt that he couldn't take the responsibility to give me the day off on Wednesday for the ordination, but that I could ask Mr. Brown. So Mr. Brown arrived, and my boss at the time said, ask Mr. Brown now for the day off, if you wouldn't mind, on Wednesday. So I asked Mr. Brown for the day off, and I told him the reason, and the answer came, well, Mr. Gunn, unfortunately, we are not a religious institution here, so I'm afraid I can't give you the day off. It's too close to Christmas. And that was the end of the story. However, my boss was brave enough to tell me that I could knock off early on the Tuesday night and get the train to Dublin and go sick on the Wednesday. So that's how I arrived in Newry, but sadly, because of a misconnection, I missed the actual ordination. And when I arrived at Newry Cathedral, the last of the congregation were exiting the cathedral. And I actually met Terry and a few of his newly ordained friends in the middle of the street. And that's how I first came in contact with him. But the family had gone up, the family were there. Not only that, but her cousin was into cinematography at the time. And the BBC filmed the ordination for the first time, and he was left on the platform to film the whole of the ordination with the cine camera. And he did that, and we still have that in the family archives, you know. So all out to Newry then, out to the Drummondine rather, to have the lunch, and walked the grounds, and then we all drove home that night and hired cars and whatever. The only thing that I would remember is that on the way up in the bus was stopped and the B specials carried out an inspection on the bus, and on the way back we were stopped by a B special patrol leaving as well. So things were a little bit tricky up in the border areas in those days as well, you know.
So how soon did Father Terry leave for Africa?
Well, that would have been in December. He was ordained, I think it was around about the 20th of December of 1960, and he then left the following October after a ceremony down in Blackrock, which was an annual ceremony at the time, sending the newly ordained missionaries off to Nigeria. And yeah, he did, and he left on the good ship Apapa, and it took them several, well, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, whatever length of time it took to get to Nigeria. And the first thing that he said to me subsequently, that when he arrived in Nigeria, the first thing that greeted him was noise. The noise of the docks, the noise of everything was tremendous. And eventually, I suppose he was stationed in Lagos for a short period of time. Then he was sent to eventually into Djibouti, and I think he stayed in Djibouti or thereabouts for the remainder of the time, the whole 14 years that he spent in Africa. I think it was in and around Djibouti. You know. What
stories did he relate to you of, and what impression of Africa did he send back to you, basically?
Well, the first one was the noise, but the second time was that the people, he really loved the people. He got on with the people so very well. There were times when it wasn't easy. Later on, of course, there was the Biafran War, but before that, he was stationed in Djibouti, and Bowen too was another name that seems to come to mind. I think Bowen was a bit further on. I think that's where the mission house was, and there was another priest there. I don't remember his name, but he was an elderly man at the time. So Terry had to settle in there. He did a lot of visiting outposts, visiting schools, and it was by a lagoon. There was a lagoon nearby, so we have photographs of him in his boat, and he used to take another man with him, and he would visit all of those regions, all of the various missions that were around that edge of that lagoon. Now, he did tell me all right that on one occasion when he was out in the middle of the lagoon, it was quite an extensive lagoon, the engine conked out. No, it was just marooned out in the centre of the lagoon, and the man that was with him was getting very, very upset about the whole thing. So Terry said, well, what we'll do now is that we'll say nothing, we'll sit tight, we'll say a prayer, and in about half an hour, we'll start up the engine again. And he did, and it started, and they finished the tour, you know. And on another occasion, he didn't take the boat on this side. There was a beach that extended for miles and miles at the edge of the lagoon, and he was to visit a school on this particular day. Now, you're talking about a fair-headed guy from Cork, and who didn't have a great deal of hair at the time either, and subsequently lost it all. But he set out anyway, on his own this time, to walk whatever lengths of time, of mileage it was, several miles I think, to get to this mission. So he brought a flask of cold cocoa with him. which was the recommended drink to take at the time if you're caught in the heat. And off he went, and he kept to the shoreline so it wouldn't be too hot, but really it was. It was baking hot. The sun was absolutely scalding down on top of him. And after several miles, he ran out of cocoa. So he had nothing. And he continued on again for another length of time, which seemed to be sort of endless, and literally eventually staggered into this little hamlet of a place. No, very much the worst was aware. So apparently there was a little shop nearby, and he went into the shop and he asked for a bottle of Coca-Cola. And there was one bottle on the shelf, and the guy behind the counter gave it to him. So he opened it and he let it down the back of his throat, except that it went all down as a jelly. It wasn't liquid anymore. It was just a lump of Coca-Cola jelly. It was the most horrible thing he ever took in all his life. But he survived. He survived, you know. He used to have all sorts of stories, particularly there was a story that he used to tell about, he was out bush, as he used to call it, one night, and he had his bed, of course, was covered with a mosquito net, and he had a tilly lamp for lighting. And he was hearing this kind of noise, a sort of bump, 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 you know, and he didn't just know where it was coming from. So he was getting a bit scared now at the stage, and it was a kind of a knock rather than a bump. And eventually, anyway, he had to get out of bed, and he went into the little oratory that was attached, and after a long time, with his tea lamp, trying to get an idea of what was going on, he spotted that there was a central shade coming down from the center of the ceiling, and there was this enormous moth stuck in the shade and was trying to get out, and it was making the knocking noise, you know. Another occasion when he heard again this kind of crackling noise in another place that he was in, and he again didn't know what it was until he went into the bathroom and found that the whole of the bath and the bathroom itself was covered in crabs that had got in through an open window, and the light must have been on in the bathroom, and it just covered the whole area, you know, from the bath and onto the floor. And he said that was this kind of a scary thing, trying to throw them out and get rid of them. And then soldier ants attacked their mission another time, and they had to get gasoline to stop them from coming into the mission. You know, there were thousands of them all around the place. And then he had one other scary story on right of another place where there was a balcony where he was, it was a long balcony, and he was on one of the rooms along the balcony, and he again heard somebody coming up the stairs, and he heard the footsteps coming up the stairs and along the balcony, and the footsteps past his door, which happened to be open because it was a very hot night, and they just went past the door and then continued on for another length until they reached the end of the balcony, turned around and came back down again, walked past his door, but he didn't see anything. He just heard the footsteps. So that kind of scared him a bit.
You mentioned the Biafran War. Did he have any contact or experience?
He didn't have any major experience other than the general mess up that was going on at the time. Although he did say to me himself that he had his escape route worked out. Now, I'm not quite sure what it was, but he had a hide to get into and to get out of, and to vacate the place as fast as he possibly could. No, thankfully, it never came to that. So it was never tried out. But I'd say the chances of he getting out mightn't have been that good, you know. But he was a resourceful fellow when he wanted to be. And if he wanted to disappear, he could. And that was always a great trait of Terry when he was at functions, because Terry wasn't he wasn't a hail fellow well met with everyone, even in the family circles. You know, he would come dutifully to a function, be it family or otherwise, but particularly in the family, particularly if there was a large crowd. And he'd be there for a while, and then you'd look around for Terry, he'd be gone. Now, he was a dab hand at just disappearing at all sorts of functions, you know, so he was well known for that, and we used to give him a right ribbing over that too. But he always sort of just smiled benignly and said he just wanted to get out as fast as he could.
Did he ever relate how the Biafran War affected the people that he was ministering to?
You see, he didn't say a great deal about anything. He was not somebody that told much about what happened. I'm quite sure that there were a lot of things that went on out there that we weren't made of, it wasn't made known to us, in other words. Particularly because he was always conscious of his mother and father, in case that they'd be upset. So he didn't tell him anything. He'd tell him the nice stories, all right, you know, and the ones that I've been telling there now, but they were all innocent stories. He kept a lot of information to himself. He wasn't one to tell stories, particularly if there was any possibility that they might upset us, or particularly his mother and father, you know. All I know about that is a photograph that appeared where he's dressed up in chieftain's robes, with a special kind of a hat as well. And apparently he was very friendly with that particular group, and they installed him as an honorary chief. Now, my mother was particularly chuffed about that, because he brought home his regalia to her, and she had it at home. It's still in the family somewhere. Who owns it now? I have no idea, but it could have gone on to one of his nieces or nephews or whatever. But my mother was so proud of the fact that her son was made a chief out in Africa.
Under what circumstances?
I don't know. I think it's just that he got on so well with them, and they actually liked him. And because, as I said, like, I mean, he wasn't a bit gregarious, you know. He was quite stubborn when he wanted to. Like Terry, when he decided not to do something, I mean, nobody, God nor man, couldn't make him do it. So whatever way he had of dealing with these people, in that group of people, I don't know if they were a tribe or not, I have no idea. But he was, I'd say, a very large, extended family, I would imagine. They obviously liked him, and they promoted him anyway, to show their gratitude to him. Presumably he was administering to them. He could have done them a few good turns. I don't know. Again, he was very secretive. You couldn't get much out of him. And they made him the chief. But I think he was chuffed about that himself too, you know. So,
was he a bit of an artist, you were saying?
He was a fine artist, he was. He just had that artistic ability. It kind of motors around in the family a bit, coming from my mother's side, but he picked up on it all right. And yeah, it was a great hobby with him. He was painting up to the time that he died, and in fact the last painting that he did was displayed at his Requiem Mass over here in the church, and it was on display there, and it was a painting of the newest member of our family, little Alice. And little Alice Gunn got herself painted by her great granduncle, and he made a very good job of it as well. And it's still hanging in a very highly prized and place of honour in my son's house in the Rochestown Road. But he did a very, very good job of it. He was mad about her, but of course we all are, because she's the youngest of the young, and she's only 4. You know, she was only 3 or even less when he made that painting. But it was a lovely painting, and he painted a great deal of scenes out in Africa, of course, and out in Nigeria, and we left a lot of them here with him, in his room, for any of the priests here that might like to take them. And we took 1 or 2 ourselves. One of the ones that he did of our childhood, where we used to go on holidays in Whitegate and White Bay. He used to paint that a lot. Yeah, he used to do cartoons for the SMA magazine as well. There are a number of those that he did back in the early days, you know. He loved animals. He had a whole menagerie of animals at one time. He had a dog, I know, at one time. He had a cat. He had a bush baby, and he had a monkey. There were 4 anyway that I know of. I'm sure he had lots of others in between times. But the cat he had first, and he got the cat as a little kitten when it had been sort of abandoned and left to die at the side of the road. And he brought the kitten back, and at that time, oh yeah, he had the monkey first, I think. And when he brought the kitten into the monkey looked at the kitten and took over the kitten, and watched over the kitten until after a day or so, the kitten came back to life again. And ever after that, the monkey was known as Dr. Ger. Now, from photographs, I didn't think he was a particularly pleasant animal, but my brother loved him anyway. And of course, he had this dog and his bush baby as well. But poor old Dr. Ger, he used to bring him everywhere with him. He used to put him up on the on his moped, and he used to sit behind him, and he used to put his 2 paws up on my brother's shoulders, and he used to look out behind Terry's head. He loved the wind in his face. But sadly, when he came home from his first leave, I think it was, he left him in the care of the priest that came in after him. And apparently he became a little cranky, and I think he bit the priest. And the priest sold him on to some youngsters, and I think he came to a sad end after that, you know. Or he didn't sell him, he actually gave him away, I think. But so poor old Dr. Ger, I'd say, didn't survive too long after my brother left. And he missed him then when he came back, but he never got another monkey again. But he did take a photograph of him sitting down reading or apparently reading the Cork Weekly Examiner, you know. So actually he loved his time out there, but then he got, his health began to break down a bit. He got a disease called filaria, that literally used, not malaria now, but filaria, that used to break out at intervals, and he would be literally wiped out for the period of time that he had that. And it was becoming more frequent. The onsets of these attacks were becoming more frequent. So eventually he was invalided home here, and I think he had to go to Drogheda, to the tropical hospital in Drogheda. He spent some time up there. And then he did a sabbatical then in Knock for a year before he came back down and took up residence down in Blackrock. So he's purser in Blackrock then for whatever length of time he was there before he came here then. And he spent the rest of his time here. He must have been here about 10 or 12 years, I'm sure, you know, as purser anyway, you know. When he came home, I taught him how to fly fish. You know, I wasn't a great man at fly fishing, but I had been taught by an expert who was a friend of mine. And before Terry came home, we used to go down to Killarney regularly, and we used to fly fish down there. So then when Terry came home, I started to talk to him about fishing, because when we were children, and certainly young boys anyway, we had a wonderful time on a farm down in White Bay, just above White Bay, on the way out to Roach's Point in Whitegate, where we literally had a wonderful childhood. 3 months of every year we were down there on the farm. We'd be out to Roach's Point virtually every night when the mackerel were in, fishing and all of that. So we developed a great love of fishing, but fly fishing was a little different to rock fishing. So anyway, I got him going on the fly fishing, and then he kind of once he liked something, then he started really to get in on it. And we used to go to a place called Lochadera regularly, which is just beyond Middleton, between Middleton and Castlemartyr. And we used to fly fish away there. And sometimes we were lucky, sometimes we were unlucky. You know, fly fishing is fly fishing, it all depends on the way the wind is blowing sometimes and the ripple on the water. So we were very close together. And then you see, he married me. And myself and my wife in 1968, in April of 68, he came back. Luckily for him, the plane that brought him into Cork for that wedding, the following week, crashed on the Tusker Rock. That was a kind of a scary thing at the time. But he survived anyway. He came in and he married us, and he stood as best he could. He baptized rather all our children except one, I think. So we had 6 children, so he baptized 5 of them anyway. So and they were mad about him. And then of course 2 years ago, coming close to it now in February of 2020, when he died here. They still miss him. We all miss him. You know, particularly I was there the day that he finally drew his last breath, and it was heartbreaking, really. You know, it was my childhood friend, really, had left. So I think of him a lot, as you can imagine, and we all do. We all miss Terry, you know, and his nieces and nephews. He was very good to his nieces and his nephews as well, because my sister's husband died at a very young age in 1973. That was the year before he came home from one of his holidays from Africa. And he really became a second father to my sister's family, you know, so they greatly miss him. I was at a wedding of one of my grandnieces last weekend, in fact, and his nephew was talking to me about him and how he still misses him, you know, and what a character he was, you know. So that was Terry.